It's the winter of 1942. The North Atlantic lies cold and cruel, waves crashing over convoys, ice forming on the decks, and beneath the surface, the silent killers of the sea, German U-boats, hunt relentlessly. Merchant ships burn on the horizon, their crews lost to the deep. The Allies are desperate. They need air cover, but their planes can't reach far enough, and their aircraft carriers are too few and too fragile. In this desperate moment, one of the strangest ideas in human history begins to form. What if the answer to Germany's naval dominance could be carved out of ice itself? Visuals fade in, a vast frozen sea, a colossal white mountain rising from the Arctic mist. On its flat surface, aircraft line up for takeoff, their engines roaring across the glistening ice. Snowdrifts swirl around as the narrator whispers, "It wasn't a fantasy, it was a plan." During World War II, scientists and military engineers genuinely attempted to build a floating aircraft carrier, not from steel or concrete, but from ice mixed with sawdust. The idea sounded absurd, even impossible. Yet it reached the highest levels of command, earning the attention, and the fascination, of Winston Churchill himself. This was not the dream of a madman. It was a government-backed engineering project with funding, blueprints, and scientists working around the clock in freezing conditions. To understand why anyone would consider building a ship made of ice, we have to look at the world through 1942 eyes. The Battle of the Atlantic was raging. German submarines, sleek, deadly, and relentless, were sinking Allied ships faster than they could be replaced. The Atlantic had become a graveyard of men and steel. Without control of these vital sea routes, Britain faced starvation and isolation. The Royal Navy needed a miracle, something that could cover the mid-Atlantic gap, the stretch of ocean too far for land-based aircraft to protect. But traditional aircraft carriers were expensive, slow to build, and constantly targeted by enemy forces. Even the mighty British and American shipyards were struggling to meet the demand. The Allies needed a new kind of weapon, something vast, durable, and impossible to sink. And so, from the depths of desperation, came the most outlandish proposal of the war, a carrier the size of a city, built from frozen water. The man behind the idea was Geoffrey Pyke, a brilliant but eccentric British inventor who believed unconventional thinking could win the war. Pyke envisioned a fleet of floating fortresses made from what he called Pykrete, a new material made by mixing ice and wood pulp. It was cheap, abundant, and surprisingly strong. When frozen properly, Pykrete could stop bullets, resist melting for long periods, and could even be repaired by simply adding water and letting it freeze again. To Pyke, it wasn't madness, it was genius. Imagine it, a ship nearly 2,000 feet long, with decks wide enough for dozens of bombers to take off and land. Its hull would be hundreds of feet thick, virtually unsinkable, since even torpedoes would barely scratch it. Inside, refrigeration systems would keep the ice solid. The ship would float quietly across the ocean, serving as a base for aircraft to hunt German U-boats and guard the convoy routes. When Churchill first heard the idea, he was intrigued. In a memo to his staff, he famously scribbled, "Make it so." The Prime Minister, a man known for his appetite for bold and unconventional ideas, saw potential where others saw insanity. The project was given the code name Project Habakkuk, after a biblical verse, "Behold ye among the heathen, and regard and wonder marvelously." And indeed, the world would soon wonder. As plans began to take shape, the vision grew ever more grand. Engineers calculated that the Iceberg carrier would displace more water than the largest ocean liners combined. It would be armed with anti-aircraft guns, capable of carrying hundreds of planes, and last for months without resupply. In theory, it could patrol the seas indefinitely, untouchable by enemy fire, and provide air cover wherever needed. But even as the concept gathered momentum, whispers of doubt began to spread. Could ice really endure the violence of war? Could it survive the pounding waves, the changing temperatures, the weight of aircraft, and the heat of engines? Engineers argued, scientists experimented, and skeptics laughed. Yet, as absurd as it seemed, the British government poured real resources into testing the idea. Behind the scenes, scientists in secret labs began to freeze blocks of ice mixed with sawdust, shooting at them to test their strength. To their astonishment, the material didn't shatter, it absorbed bullets like a sponge. The idea was no longer a joke, it was a possibility. Still, as the frozen dream began to grow, one haunting question loomed. Why did they believe this would work, and what would it take to build an entire warship out of ice? As the Arctic winds howled and the war raged on, a handful of men prepared to take this impossible idea from theory to reality. They would soon head into the Canadian wilderness to test the first prototype, and the results would shock even the boldest minds of the war. But for now, in 1942, with Britain under siege and U-boats ruling the Atlantic, the world had yet to see the strangest war machine ever imagined, a frozen fortress of hope, born not from steel or fire, but from ice. The problem: Germany's naval nightmare. The year is 1942, and the Atlantic Ocean has become a vast killing field. The gray waters churn with wreckage, burning oil slicks stretch for miles, lifeboats drift aimlessly, and survivors cling to debris as the cold eats away their strength. Beneath the waves lurk the predators of Hitler's Kriegsmarine, the U-boats, silent, deadly, and unstoppable. Every night, Allied convoys vanish into the sea. Merchant ships loaded with food, fuel, and weapons never reach Britain. Entire fleets are torn apart before dawn. The Battle of the Atlantic isn't just another campaign, it's a war for survival. If Britain's supply lines collapse, the island nation will starve. And without Britain, there will be no staging ground for the liberation of Europe. The problem is as vast as the ocean itself. The Allies can't see their enemy. German submarines operate freely in what sailors call the Black Pit, the mid-Atlantic gap beyond the range of Allied aircraft. Planes from Newfoundland can't fly far enough east, and bombers from Britain can't reach far enough west. That gap, 1,000 miles of unguarded sea, becomes a hunting ground. Convoys enter it with dread, knowing they might not come out. The solution, in theory, is simple: more air cover. But in practice, it's impossible. Aircraft carriers are the only ships that can bring planes close to the U-boats, but they are expensive, slow to build, and easy to sink. By 1942, the Allies have only a handful of carriers, each one precious, each one a high-value target. The Royal Navy can't risk losing them in the mid-Atlantic, where U-boats stalk in packs and weather destroys even the strongest hulls. As Churchill reviews the grim reports, frustration builds. Convoys are being decimated. The Royal Navy's escort ships are stretched thin, and radar coverage is patchy at best. Each month, more than 500,000 tons of Allied shipping is being sunk. The numbers are unsustainable. Something has to change, and fast. That's when the line between innovation and madness begins to blur. Inside Britain's war machine, scientists, strategists, and dreamers are called to think the unthinkable. The Ministry of Defense sends out desperate memos. We need new ideas, any ideas. Out of this chaos comes a parade of eccentric proposals: floating runways, massive sea fortresses, and even artificial islands made from concrete. Most of them are dismissed immediately. But one stands out, a plan so bizarre that it demands attention. It comes from a man who doesn't think like anyone else, Geoffrey Pyke, an inventor working with Britain's Combined Operations Headquarters. Pyke's solution to the U-boat nightmare isn't more steel, more ships, or more bombs. Instead, it's ice. To understand why Pyke's idea seems so revolutionary, imagine the mindset of 1942. The Allies are losing ground everywhere: Rommel in North Africa, Japan in the Pacific, and Hitler's U-boats in the Atlantic. The world feels like it's closing in. Traditional military thinking has failed to deliver quick answers. So to outsmart the enemy, the Allies must think beyond the limits of physics, logic, and sometimes sanity. Pyke argues that steel and fuel are scarce, but water, frozen water, is everywhere. In his mind, ice can become the foundation of a new kind of warship. He envisions a floating airbase made not from metal but from frozen seawater, immune to torpedoes, immune to scarcity, and able to support aircraft deep in the Atlantic Gap. Churchill, known for entertaining wild ideas, listens. He understands one thing better than anyone: desperation drives innovation. When the odds are impossible, even the strangest solutions deserve a hearing. But before Churchill approves anything, his advisors make one thing clear: the enemy is getting stronger. Germany's U-boats now operate in wolf packs, coordinated through enigma-coded messages. They strike under the cover of darkness, surfacing to fire torpedoes, then vanishing back into the depths. Their new commander, Admiral Karl Donitz, is a master of underwater warfare. Every convoy sunk is a victory that brings Britain closer to defeat. The Allies throw everything they have at the problem: sonar, depth charges, and new escort ships, but the results are mixed. Each technological leap is matched by a German counter. The ocean remains a graveyard of Allied hopes. In the war rooms of London, the mood turns grim. The Prime Minister knows that without a radical breakthrough, the Atlantic War could be lost. He writes in his memos that the only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. And that's when the idea of an Iceberg aircraft carrier begins to sound less insane and more necessary. Because if Pike is right, if a massive, unsinkable platform can be built from frozen water, it could change everything. It could close the mid-Atlantic gap, give constant air cover to convoys, and turn the tide of the war. Still, skeptics remain. Admirals laugh at the idea. Engineers call it fantasy. But Churchill, ever the gambler, gives it a single daring chance: build me a model. Prove that it can float. Then we'll talk. And so, from the ashes of desperation, the blueprint for the most bizarre weapon in history is born. Soon, scientists will venture into the icy wilderness of Canada to bring this impossible vision to life: a floating fortress of frozen hope meant to defeat Hitler's deadly submarines. The Germans may dominate the Atlantic for now, but a new kind of weapon, one carved from nature itself, is about to rise from the cold. The birth of an iceberg carrier. In the depths of Britain's wartime desperation, one name begins to echo through the corridors of power: Geoffrey Pike. A man both brilliant and baffling, Pike is not a conventional scientist. He's a dreamer, a thinker who challenges every assumption of modern warfare. With unkempt hair, restless eyes, and a mind that moves faster than his words, he is often dismissed as eccentric, even mad. But in wartime, madness can sometimes look a lot like genius. Pike's proposal sounds like something out of science fiction: a ship made of ice. Not just any ship, but a floating fortress, 2,000 feet long and hundreds of feet thick, large enough to carry squadrons of bombers, store thousands of tons of supplies, and even withstand torpedo attacks. His vision is simple yet staggering: if steel is scarce and ice is abundant, why not use what nature provides? Most military men laugh. They picture a massive iceberg melting in the middle of the Atlantic, collapsing under its own weight. But Pike insists that it's possible, not with ordinary ice, but with a new material he's discovered: Pykrete. Named after himself, Pykrete is a bizarre combination of frozen water and wood pulp. The mixture creates something astonishing: stronger than ice, resistant to cracking, and so tough that a bullet fired at it simply embeds itself without shattering the block. In tests, engineers even discover that it melts incredibly slowly, especially when insulated. It is, in Pike's words, nature's answer to steel. Soon, Pike's wild idea captures the attention of the one man whose imagination matches his own: Winston Churchill. When the Prime Minister first hears of it, he's in his bathtub, reading the report between cigar puffs. He scribbles a simple order across the top of the memo: make it so. With those 3 words, the craziest engineering project of World War II officially begins. The plan is breathtaking in scale. Codenamed Project Habakkuk, it envisions a ship so large it could never be sunk, a floating runway in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The proposed dimensions are staggering: over 2,000 feet long, 300 feet wide, and 200 feet thick. It would displace more water than any ship in history and host a fleet of bombers capable of striking submarines anywhere in the ocean. The hull would be built from blocks of Pykrete, insulated with cork and refrigerated by an internal cooling system to prevent melting. The structure would be so massive that even a torpedo strike would barely dent it. The surrounding ice would simply refreeze. But there's one problem. No one knows if it will actually work. To test Pyke's idea, Churchill authorizes a secret experiment deep in the frozen wilderness of Alberta, Canada. A small team of engineers, scientists, and carpenters set up camp on the remote shores of Lake Patricia, near Jasper National Park. The location is chosen for its isolation. No spies, no prying eyes, just endless ice and silence. Under the leadership of Lord Mountbatten, the project takes shape. In the bitter cold, workers build a miniature prototype, a Pykrete barge about 60 feet long, complete with refrigeration pipes and insulation layers. It's not elegant, but it floats. And more importantly, it doesn't melt. When tested, the Pykrete model proves shockingly resilient. Conventional ice cracks and splinters when hit, but Pykrete withstands blows from hammers, bullets, and even small explosives. In one famous demonstration, Mountbatten fires a pistol at a block of ice. It shatters instantly. Then he fires at a block of Pykrete. The bullet bounces off, nearly injuring a nearby officer. The point is made. Excitement spreads through the Allied command. If this can be scaled up, it could change the war. A fleet of Pykrete carriers could patrol the Atlantic indefinitely, immune to torpedoes and providing permanent air cover over convoys. The imagination of the era runs wild. Engineers draft blueprints showing an enormous ice supercarrier, complete with aircraft hangars, anti-aircraft guns, and crew quarters carved into frozen corridors. It's a floating city, self-repairing, self-cooling, and theoretically unsinkable. But as the project advances, so do the complications. For one, construction logistics are nightmarish. The ship would require more than 300,000 tons of wood pulp and 10,000 tons of steel piping just for the cooling systems. It would take an army of workers and months of freezing labor to build a single vessel. Even more troubling, the project would demand massive refrigeration units running day and night. Without them, the carrier would slowly melt into the sea. Meanwhile, Pyke's own erratic behavior begins to draw concern. He bombards the War Office with long, chaotic memos filled with philosophical tangents and radical side ideas. Some officials quietly begin calling him the mad professor. Still, Churchill continues to back him, at least for now. By early 1943, the prototype on Lake Patricia has survived an entire summer, proof that the concept works. But when experts from the Royal Navy and U.S. Navy visit the site, doubts grow. The scale seems impossible. The resources too immense. And most importantly, by that time, the tide of the war is shifting. Allied factories are churning out escort carriers faster than ever before. New long-range bombers can now patrol the mid-Atlantic gap without ice fortresses. Slowly, interest in Project Habakkuk begins to fade. What started as a wild dream, born out of desperation, now seems like a beautiful but impractical fantasy. The war's momentum is turning, and Britain's need for floating icebergs is slipping away. Still, for a brief, astonishing moment in history, the idea of a 2,000-foot-long frozen aircraft carrier captures the imagination of a world at war. It stands as a symbol of human creativity pushed to its limits, a reminder that even in the darkest times, imagination can be both our greatest weapon and our strangest hope. And as the cold winds whip across Lake Patricia, the frozen prototype remains, a silent monument to an idea too bold to last, but too brilliant to be forgotten. Testing the impossible. Winter, 1943, deep in the Canadian Rockies, at a frozen lake called Lake Patricia. Amid the snow-covered pines, a handful of British and Canadian engineers worked in secrecy on one of the strangest military experiments of the entire war. Their mission: to see if a ship made of ice could actually survive gunfire, temperature changes, and time itself. The project was code-named Habakkuk, after the biblical prophet, a name chosen because it sounded mysterious enough to keep curious minds away. The plan was simple in theory, but staggering in scale. Before they could build a 2,000-foot-long floating airbase, they had to prove that Pykrete, this new material made from ice and wood pulp, could actually hold together. So they built a miniature version, about 60 feet long, right there on the lake. The prototype wasn't elegant. It looked like a frozen barge, half submerged and constantly tended by men carrying hoses and axes. But it was revolutionary. The engineers used refrigerated pipes to keep the ice cool, even as the spring thaw approached. Then came the real test. To measure its durability, the scientists pulled out rifles and handguns. They fired bullets directly into the Pykrete wall, and to everyone's shock, the bullets didn't shatter it. They bounced off. The ice didn't splinter or crack. It absorbed the impact, proving that Pykrete was indeed stronger than pure ice, tougher than many metals, and almost impossible to sink. But not everyone was convinced. When Lord Mountbatten demonstrated it for senior officers, he famously fired his revolver into a block of regular ice. It shattered instantly. Then he shot a block of Pykrete. The bullet ricocheted and nearly hit a British admiral in the leg. The demonstration was chaotic, but unforgettable. The test at Lake Patricia confirmed the idea was scientifically possible. The frozen hull resisted not only bullets but also attempts to chip it with axes. A ship made of this material could, in theory, take hits from bombs and torpedoes and keep floating. It was self-healing in the cold, reparable with just a hose and a bucket of water. But soon, the dream began to melt, literally. Engineers discovered that even in Canada's cold climate, the Pykrete structure needed constant refrigeration to stay solid. Without massive cooling systems, the carrier would slowly deform, the surface turning slick and unstable. Maintaining such a system across thousands of feet of ice would require an enormous amount of power, far more than any generator could supply in the middle of the Atlantic. Then there was the problem of scale. To meet Churchill's vision, the full-sized Habakkuk would have to be 2,000 feet long, 300 feet wide, and 200 feet tall, weighing over 2 million tons. It would need a small city's worth of materials, steel reinforcements, and refrigeration pipes running through every deck. Building it in wartime, while resources were already stretched thin, seemed nearly impossible. Still, the test proved one thing beyond doubt: human imagination had no limits. What started as an eccentric idea scribbled on paper had now taken physical form on a frozen Canadian lake. The engineers stood proudly beside their icy creation, watching steam rise from its surface in the morning sun, knowing they had built something the world had never seen before. For a brief, frozen moment, it felt like anything was possible, that science could reshape the very elements of nature to fight tyranny. But beneath that optimism lay the first cracks, not in the ice, but in the dream itself. Logistics, costs, and the changing tides of war would soon turn this marvel of frozen ingenuity into one of history's most fascinating what-ifs. The test was over. The world's first ice ship had survived the bullets. But the real battle, keeping it alive, was only beginning. Testing the impossible. Winter, 1943, deep in the Canadian Rockies, at a frozen lake called Lake Patricia. Amid the snow-covered pines, a handful of British and Canadian engineers worked in secrecy on one of the strangest military experiments of the entire war. Their mission: to see if a ship made of ice could actually survive gunfire, temperature changes, and time itself. The project was code-named Habakkuk, after the biblical prophet, a name chosen because it sounded mysterious enough to keep curious minds away. The plan was simple in theory, but staggering in scale. Before they could build a 2,000-foot-long floating airbase, they had to prove that Pykrete, this new material made from ice and wood pulp, could actually hold together. So they built a miniature version, about 60 feet long, right there on the lake. The prototype wasn't elegant. It looked like a frozen barge, half submerged and constantly tended by men carrying hoses and axes. But it was revolutionary. The engineers used refrigerated pipes to keep the ice cool, even as the spring thaw approached. Then came the real test. To measure its durability, the scientists pulled out rifles and handguns. They fired bullets directly into the Pykrete wall, and to everyone's shock, the bullets didn't shatter it. They bounced off. The ice didn't splinter or crack. It absorbed the impact, proving that Pykrete was indeed stronger than pure ice, tougher than many metals, and almost impossible to sink. But not everyone was convinced. When Lord Mountbatten demonstrated it for senior officers, he famously fired his revolver into a block of regular ice. It shattered instantly. Then he shot a block of Pykrete. The bullet ricocheted and nearly hit a British admiral in the leg. The demonstration was chaotic, but unforgettable. The test at Lake Patricia confirmed the idea was scientifically possible. The frozen hull resisted not only bullets but also attempts to chip it with axes. A ship made of this material could, in theory, take hits from bombs and torpedoes and keep floating. It was self-healing in the cold, reparable with just a hose and a bucket of water. But soon, the dream began to melt, literally. Engineers discovered that even in Canada's cold climate, the Pykrete structure needed constant refrigeration to stay solid. Without massive cooling systems, the carrier would slowly deform, the surface turning slick and unstable. Maintaining such a system across thousands of feet of ice would require an enormous amount of power, far more than any generator could supply in the middle of the Atlantic. Then there was the problem of scale. To meet Churchill's vision, the full-sized Habakkuk would have to be 2,000 feet long, 300 feet wide, and 200 feet tall, weighing over 2 million tons. It would need a small city's worth of materials, steel reinforcements, and refrigeration pipes running through every deck. Building it in wartime, while resources were already stretched thin, seemed nearly impossible. Still, the test proved one thing beyond doubt: human imagination had no limits. What started as an eccentric idea scribbled on paper had now taken physical form on a frozen Canadian lake. The engineers stood proudly beside their icy creation, watching steam rise from its surface in the morning sun, knowing they had built something the world had never seen before. For a brief, frozen moment, it felt like anything was possible, that science could reshape the very elements of nature to fight tyranny. But beneath that optimism lay the first cracks, not in the ice, but in the dream itself. Logistics, costs, and the changing tides of war would soon turn this marvel of frozen ingenuity into one of history's most fascinating what-ifs. The test was over. The world's first ice ship had survived the bullets. But the real battle, keeping it alive, was only beginning. The idea that never sailed. By 1944, the frozen dream of Project Habakkuk had reached its quiet and inevitable end. What began as one of the most imaginative and bizarre engineering projects of World War II was now melting into obscurity, both literally and figuratively. The idea of building an aircraft carrier from ice had once captured the imagination of Winston Churchill himself, but war moves fast, and even the boldest concepts can become irrelevant overnight. The decision to officially abandon Project Habakkuk came after months of delays, spiraling costs, and mounting technical obstacles. Reports from Canada showed that even the prototype, a mere fraction of the planned full-scale ship, was struggling to survive its own design. Despite thick insulation and a refrigeration network humming beneath its frozen surface, the test model constantly leaked, softened, and sagged. Engineers had done their best to patch and reinforce it, but the truth was undeniable: nature was winning. Meanwhile, on the battlefront, everything was changing. The Allies had achieved major victories in North Africa and Italy. In the skies above the Atlantic, new long-range patrol aircraft like the B-24 Liberator were now keeping U-boats in check. Advances in radar and sonar allowed Allied convoys to detect and destroy submarines before they could strike. The desperate need for an unsinkable icebound carrier had evaporated. By early 1944, military planners began to see Habakkuk as an outdated solution to a fading problem. It was no longer the weapon of the future, it was a relic of the past. What had once seemed like a revolutionary concept now looked like an expensive, impractical fantasy. The British Admiralty quietly reclassified the project, shifting resources toward more conventional and proven technologies. Then came the final order. Without ceremony, without a press release, and without even a farewell photograph, the project was terminated. Funding stopped. Blueprints were shelved. The engineers who had once worked day and night in frozen hangars were reassigned to more urgent wartime needs. Habakkuk would never be built, not even as a scaled-down prototype beyond Lake Patricia. Left unattended, the small test model in Canada began to melt slowly into the water. Its once solid hull softened as spring sunlight returned to the region. The wooden pulp that had given the ice its strength started to separate, turning the once innovative Pykrete into nothing more than muddy slush. Day by day, the structure shrank, breaking apart and sinking beneath the lake's calm surface. Within months, the ship that was supposed to change naval warfare had vanished entirely, leaving behind nothing but ripples and a few rusting metal pipes. The story of Habakkuk was soon buried under the avalanche of wartime headlines. The world was focused on the Normandy landings, the liberation of Europe, and the approaching end of the war. There was no space in the newspapers for the failure of an ice ship. For decades, the project remained classified, hidden deep in military archives, almost forgotten by history. And yet, looking back, it's hard not to marvel at the strange beauty of the idea. Habakkuk embodied the perfect paradox of wartime innovation, the mixture of brilliance and absurdity that emerges when humanity is pushed to its limits. On one hand, it was absurd to imagine building a city-sized aircraft carrier out of ice. On the other, it represented something profoundly human, the refusal to accept defeat, the willingness to dream, to experiment, to turn imagination into a weapon. Its creator, Geoffrey Pyke, wasn't a traditional scientist or soldier. He was a visionary, and perhaps a little mad, who saw potential where others saw impossibility. His idea may have failed in practice, but it succeeded in spirit. It showed that even in the darkest hours of the war, when Britain faced annihilation and the Atlantic was ruled by German submarines, people were still thinking, still inventing, still daring to imagine new ways to survive. In the end, Habakkuk never sailed, but its story remains one of the most fascinating what-ifs of the Second World War. It reminds us that human progress often depends on those who are willing to try the impossible, even when the result melts away. Today, beneath the quiet waters of Lake Patricia, fragments of that icy dream still lie buried in the cold depths. The steel reinforcement rods and a few traces of Pykrete remain as silent witnesses to a time when engineers thought they could reshape nature itself. The Iceberg carrier may never have left the dock, but the idea, the courage to think beyond the limits of logic, continues to inspire. In the strange and wondrous theater of World War II, Habakkuk stands as a symbol of both the madness and the genius of human invention. It was a dream too cold to live, but too bold to forget. Legacy and reflection. Today, the strange saga of Project Habakkuk stands as one of the most curious testaments to human imagination ever conceived during wartime. What began as an outlandish idea, an aircraft carrier carved from ice, now serves as a powerful reminder of how desperation can ignite creativity in ways both brilliant and bizarre. The world of 1942 was a crucible of chaos. Britain was isolated, the Atlantic swarmed with German U-boats, and the fate of supply convoys decided the survival of nations. Out of that pressure came ideas that seemed to defy sanity: flying tanks, bat bombs, radar-invisible ships, and even a frozen aircraft carrier. To many, Habakkuk was madness. To a few, it was a spark of genius. Though the project never succeeded, its legacy lives in what it represented: the limitless capacity of the human mind to search for solutions in the unlikeliest of places. Geoffrey Pyke, the eccentric inventor behind the plan, wasn't thinking about glory, he was thinking about survival. He believed that nature itself could be engineered to serve mankind's defense. His use of Pykrete, that strange fusion of ice and sawdust tougher than steel, was a testament to creative science under pressure. Even though it never reached the battlefield, it proved a concept that later inspired materials research for decades. But more than its technical curiosity, Habakkuk's story speaks to something deeper, a reflection on the psychology of wartime innovation. When humanity is cornered by danger, imagination becomes its last refuge. In those moments, the line between brilliance and absurdity blurs, and invention becomes an act of survival. Churchill understood this well. He encouraged bold ideas, even the impractical ones, because he knew that one impossible idea out of 100 might change the course of history. His war rooms were filled with strange proposals, from magnetized mines to exploding rats, and among them was this frozen dream of a ship that would never melt. For him, Habakkuk symbolized the essence of British ingenuity, to fight with wit when weapons fell short. In a way, the Iceberg carrier wasn't just a project, it was a metaphor for resilience. Built to endure the fire of war, born from frozen fear, and ultimately undone by the thaw of peace. It showed that even failure can be valuable when it stretches the boundaries of what's possible. The lessons learned from Habakkuk, in logistics, materials, and creative problem-solving, quietly influenced future generations of engineers and scientists. And yet, there's an irony to it all. As the prototype melted away into the cold Canadian lake, so too did the urgency that had created it. The Allies had found better weapons, and the ice ship became a forgotten ghost of wartime imagination. But sometimes, the worth of an idea isn't in whether it works, it's in the courage to dream it. So, what does Habakkuk teach us today? That human progress often begins with absurdity. That imagination, even when it fails, is never wasted. And that in times of despair, the human mind is capable of freezing hope into solid form, even if only for a while. As historians reflect on this extraordinary chapter of World War II, they see not just an engineering failure, but a triumph of creativity under fire. The ice carrier may never have sailed, but its spirit endures, a frozen monument to human ingenuity. And if Winston Churchill were here to look back on this frosty experiment, that massive floating glacier armed with planes and dreams, he might have smiled, lit his cigar, and said in his wry, indomitable tone, "Never was so much thought frozen for so little use." A fitting epitaph for a ship made of ice, and a reminder that even in failure, imagination is the most unsinkable vessel of all.